I stepped through the front door of my childhood home carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing what I thought would be a genuine smile for the first time in months. The familiar scent of my mother's cooking filled the air, and I could hear laughter echoing from the living room where my family had gathered for our annual New Year's Eve celebration. At 32, I had finally reached a place in my life where I felt proud of what I had accomplished. My software engineering career was thriving. I had just bought my own house, and I was ready to toast to new beginnings with the people who mattered most. But as the clock struck midnight and we all raised our glasses, my mother looked directly at me with a serious expression that made my stomach drop and declared without any warning or discussion, "Your sister's overwhelmed Mason. You'll be paying her rent from now on, simple as that." My father immediately smirked and added with cold finality, "If you say no, don't come back." I raised my glass higher and said, "Then goodbye and good luck paying your problems." The silence that followed my declaration was deafening. I set my champagne glass down on the coffee table with deliberate precision and looked around the room at faces that suddenly seemed like strangers. My sister Sarah, who had been sprawled across the leather recliner in her designer jeans and brand new sweater, sat up with an expression of shock that quickly transformed into indignant rage. "You can't be serious right now," she hissed her voice, rising to that familiar whine I remembered from our childhood arguments. "I'm going through a really tough time, and family is supposed to help family." I studied her carefully, taking in details I had been too polite to notice before. The sweater she wore had tags from an expensive boutique downtown. Her nails were freshly manicured with intricate nail art that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. The designer handbag sitting beside her chair was something I had seen in store windows with price tags that made me wince. "What exactly is overwhelming you, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Last I heard, you quit your job at the coffee shop because the manager asked you to show up on time." My mother jumped to Sarah's defense immediately, her face flushing with protective anger. "That's not fair, Mason. She's been struggling with anxiety, and that boss was completely unreasonable with his expectations." Anxiety about working. I pressed, genuinely curious about how this logic worked in their minds. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wanting to end this conversation before it went any deeper. "Look, son, we're not asking you to support her forever. Just until she gets back on her feet." I pulled out my phone and opened Instagram, scrolling to Sarah's profile. The evidence was right there in living color, posted for anyone to see. Is this getting back on her feet? I turned the screen toward them, showing a photo from 3 days ago of Sarah at an upscale brunch restaurant surrounded by friends and multiple mimosa glasses. The caption read, "Living my best life while I figure things out." Sometimes you just have to treat yourself. Sarah's face went pale, then bright red. That was just one meal, and my friend paid for most of it. "What about this?" I swiped to another photo showing her at a shopping mall with multiple bags from high-end stores. Or this, another swipe revealed pictures from an expensive nail salon. And this, the final photo showed her sitting in a brand new car keys dangling from her manicured fingers. Where exactly did the money for all this come from if you're too overwhelmed to work? I asked, my voice getting harder with each word. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. My mother's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. My father stared at the phone screen with a confused expression, as if he was seeing these images for the first time. "I saved up," Sarah said weakly, but her voice lacked any conviction. "From your unemployment benefits," I pressed. "Because I happen to know that Jake saw you working cash shifts at that catering company downtown. The same Jake who's been doing plumbing work all over the city and happens to know a lot of people. Jake had been my best friend since high school, a straight-talking guy who worked with his hands and had no patience for people who tried to game the system. When I had mentioned Sarah's situation to him earlier that week, he had gotten a strange look on his face. and asked if I wanted to know what he had really been seeing around town. She's been bragging to people. I continued watching my family's faces carefully. Her roommate Amanda told me Sarah's been saying she found a way to get her sucker brother to pay her bills while she figures out what she wants to do with her life. The betrayal in those words hit me harder than I expected. I had always been the responsible one, the one who studied hard, worked, extra hours, saved money instead of spending it on immediate gratification. And while I was building a career and trying to create stability in my life, my sister had been plotting to use me as her personal financial safety net. "That's not true," Sarah protested, but tears were starting to form in her eyes, and not the kind that came from sadness. These were tears of frustration and anger at being caught. "Amanda also mentioned something interesting about your credit card debt," I added quietly. "Something about $15,000 you've been hiding from everyone." The sharp intake of breath from my mother told me everything I needed to know. This was news to them too. Sarah's face crumpled completely and she buried her face in her hands. "How could you have $15,000 in debt?" my father demanded, his voice shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. But I was already putting pieces together in my mind, remembering conversations and situations that hadn't made sense at the time. The expensive birthday gifts Sarah had given people over the past 2 years. The weekend trips she had taken with friends to beach resorts. The complete lack of stress she seemed to feel about money while claiming to be struggling. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a temporary rough patch or anxiety about work. This was a calculated lifestyle choice funded by credit cards and now by a demand that I become her unwilling financial sponsor. I looked around the room at my parents, who seemed to be processing this information for the first time. Despite my anger, I felt a flicker of sympathy for them. They had been manipulated just as much as I had, probably more so. "I need some air," I said, heading toward the back door that led to the small garden where I used to play as a child. As I stepped outside into the cold January night, I could hear voices rising inside the house, my parents demanding explanations that I suspected would only reveal deeper levels of deception. The magnitude of what I just discovered was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about paying rent. This was about a fundamental lack of honesty in my family, a willingness to manipulate and exploit that went deeper than I had ever imagined. And I had a sinking feeling that what I had uncovered tonight was only the beginning. I spent the next 3 days avoiding phone calls from my parents and diving deep into research that I knew would probably break my heart. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined possible. It started with a conversation with my uncle Thomas, my father's younger brother, who worked as an accountant for a small firm downtown. I had always respected Thomas for his straightforward manner and his reluctance to get involved in family drama. When I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee, the long pause on the other end of the line told me he had been expecting this conversation. "I was wondering when someone would start asking the right questions," he said, when we sat down at a quiet corner table at the diner near his office. Thomas looked older than I remembered, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested he had been carrying worries he couldn't share. "How bad is it?" I asked directly, knowing that beating around the bush wouldn't help anyone at this point. Thomas stirred his coffee slowly, considering his words carefully. "Your parents came to me about 6 months ago asking about bankruptcy procedures, not for a client, for themselves." The words hit me like a physical blow. My parents had always seemed financially stable, maybe not wealthy, but comfortable enough to maintain their house and lifestyle without obvious stress. They've refinanced the house twice in the past 3 years. Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The first time was to pay off credit cards that they said had gotten out of hand. The second time was to cover what they called family emergencies. Sarah's emergencies, we said, and it wasn't a question. Thomas nodded grimly. Over $30,000 in the past 2 years. Car repairs that turned out to be a down payment on a new lease. Medical expenses that were actually credit card bills. emergency rent payments for 3 different apartments when she kept breaking leases. I felt physically sick. While I had been living my life working hard and trying to build something stable, my family had been spiraling into financial crisis to support my sister's refusal to take responsibility for herself. "There's more," Thomas said, and somehow his expression got even more serious. "They took out a second mortgage last year. The payments are killing them, and they're already 3 months behind." "How long before foreclosure?" I asked, dreading the answer. 60 days, maybe less, if the bank decides to accelerate the process." I stared at my coffee cup, watching the steam rise and dissipate, much like my illusions about my family's stability. "Why didn't they tell me?" "Your father is proud," Thomas said simply, "and your mother is convinced that Sarah just needs a little more help to get on track. They genuinely believed that if you started paying her rent, it would free up enough of their money to catch up on the mortgage." The manipulative brilliance of it was almost impressive. By framing the request as help for Sarah, they had avoided having to admit their own financial desperation. They had turned me into the potential solution for a crisis I didn't even know existed. "There's something else you need to know," Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "I drove past their house yesterday and saw this." He showed me a photo of a legal notice taped to my parents' front door. Even from the image on his phone, I could make out enough of the text to understand what I was looking at. "Foreclosure proceedings have already started," Thomas explained. "This isn't a future possibility anymore. It's happening." I left the diner feeling like I was walking through a fog of disbelief. My parents were facing the loss of their home, had been struggling financially for years, and instead of coming to me honestly for help, they had concocted a scheme to make me pay for Sarah's lifestyle while hiding the real crisis. But the story got even worse when I stopped by the house that afternoon while my parents were at work. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had lived next door for 20 years, was in her front yard tending to her winter garden. "Mason," she called out with obvious relief in her voice. "I'm so glad to see you. I've been worried sick about your parents." Mrs. Henderson had always been the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, someone who noticed everything that happened on the street, but rarely gossiped maliciously. If she was worried, there was definitely something to worry about. "I keep seeing official-looking people coming to the house," she said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Men in suits with clipboards taking pictures of the property? Your poor mother always looks so stressed when she comes home from work." She described a parade of bank representatives, legal officials, and property assessors that had been visiting my parents' house over the past several weeks. The picture she painted was of people who were drowning quietly, trying to handle a crisis they couldn't control, while maintaining the appearance that everything was normal. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her genuine concern evident in her weathered face. "I'm working on it," I told her, though I honestly had no idea what working on it would look like. That evening, I called David Patterson, a family attorney who had handled some legal work for my father's small business years ago. David had always been straight with our family, someone who gave honest advice even when it wasn't what people wanted to hear. "I was wondering, when I hear from someone in your family," David said when I explained why I was calling. "Your parents consulted me about bankruptcy options last month." "What did you tell them?" "That they need to stop the financial bleeding before filing makes any sense," David replied bluntly. "Bankruptcy can protect them from creditors, but it won't help if they keep spending money they don't have on someone who won't take responsibility for herself." David confirmed what Thomas had told me and added details that made the situation even more frightening. My parents had been using credit cards to make mortgage payments, borrowing against their retirement funds, and taking cash advances to cover basic living expenses. They were in what he called a financial death spiral, where every month put them deeper in debt with no realistic way to climb out. "The irony," David said, "is that your income probably could help stabilize their situation, but not if they're simultaneously supporting your sister's spending habits. It would be like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom." I hung up feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. My parents weren't just enablers, they were victims of their own enabling. They had bankrupted themselves trying to fix problems that couldn't be fixed with money, and now they were facing the loss of everything they had worked for their entire lives. But I also felt a cold anger building inside me. Instead of trusting me with the truth, they had tried to manipulate me into becoming part of the problem. They had been willing to sacrifice my financial security to continue enabling Sarah's irresponsible behavior, all while hiding the fact that their own ship was sinking. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went, and then I was going to figure out how to fix it. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what my family had been hiding from me. I had a feeling that what I had discovered so far was just the tip of the iceberg. I spent the rest of the week carefully planning what I knew had to be done. If my family was going to manipulate me with false information, I decided it was time to give them an opportunity to tell the truth, or to reveal just how far they were willing to go with their deception. I called my mother on Sunday afternoon and asked if we could have a family meeting to discuss Sarah's situation properly. I made sure to sound apologetic and concerned, as if I had been thinking over their request and wanted to find a way to help. "Oh, Mason," my mother said, and I could hear the relief flooding her voice. "I'm so glad you called. We've all been so worried about how things ended on New Year's Eve. I just want to do the right thing for the family." I told her, which was absolutely true, even if my definition of the right thing was probably different from hers. We arranged to meet at their house the following evening. I asked my girlfriend Claire to come with me, both for emotional support and as a witness to whatever was about to unfold. Claire Williams was probably the most level-headed person I had ever met. As an elementary school teacher, she had spent years dealing with children who tried to manipulate situations to get their way, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to see through deception. When I had told her about everything I had discovered over the past week, her response had been both supportive and brutally practical. "You need to give them a chance to be honest," she had said. "But you also need to be prepared for the possibility that they won't take it." The evening of the meeting, Claire and I arrived at my parents' house to find my entire immediate family assembled in the living room with an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Sarah was dressed more conservatively than usual, wearing a simple sweater and jeans that made her look younger and more vulnerable. My parents had obviously coached her on how to present herself. "Before we start I said, sitting down across from them with Claire beside me, "I want everyone to understand that I care about this family and I want to help. But I also need complete honesty about what's really happening." My father nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, son. We just want what's best for everyone." "Good," I said, pulling out a small notebook where I had written down some questions. "Sarah, can you walk me through your current financial situation, your income, your expenses, your debts, everything?" Sarah glanced at our parents before answering. "Well, I'm not working right now because of my anxiety issues. The unemployment barely covers my basic expenses, and I'm behind on rent because of some unexpected medical bills." "What kind of medical bills?" I asked. "Therapy," she said quickly, "for the anxiety." "And how much do you owe in total, including credit cards and other debts?" Another glance at our parents. "Maybe $3,000 or $4,000. Nothing I can't handle once I get back to work." I wrote down her answers, even though I knew every word was a lie. "And what about you?" I asked my parents. "How is your financial situation?" "We're doing fine," my mother said firmly. "This isn't about us. We just want to help Sarah get through a rough patch." "So if I agree to pay Sarah's rent, that would solve the immediate problem?" "Absolutely," my father said. $800 a month just temporarily until she gets back on her feet." I pretended to consider this, making notes and asking follow-up questions about timeframes and expectations. The longer the conversation went on, the more confident they became that I was buying their version of events. Then Sarah made the mistake I had been hoping for. "Actually, she said, leaning forward with growing excitement, "there are a few other things that would really help me get stable. My credit card payments are pretty high right now, and my car payment is killing me. If you could help with those too, I could probably get back to work much faster. I looked up from my notebook, maintaining a neutral expression. How much are we talking about? The credit card minimums are about $400 a month, and my car payment is $550, so maybe $1,500 total. $1,500 a month, I repeated. Just until I'm working again, she said quickly. And maybe a little extra for groceries and gas. Say 200. My parents were nodding along as if these were all reasonable requests. My mother actually reached over and patted Sarah's hand supportively. So $1,700 a month total, I asked. Well, Sarah said, emboldened by their apparent acceptance, if we're being realistic about what I need to get back on my feet, it might be better to round up to 2,000. That would give me a little breathing room to focus on my mental health instead of constantly stressing about money. I wrote this down carefully, then looked around the room. Just to be clear, you're asking me to give Sarah $24,000 a year while she figures things out. Family helps family, my father said firmly. You're doing well, and this is what families do. And this is temporary, I pressed. Of course, my mother said. Just until she's in a better place mentally and can get back to work. At that moment, the front door opened and someone walked into the house without knocking. I turned to see a young man I didn't recognize wearing expensive sneakers and a designer jacket with the kind of confident swagger that suggested he was very comfortable making himself at home. Hey, babe, he said to Sarah, completely ignoring the rest of us. Are we still hitting that new club downtown tonight? I heard they've got bottle service specials on Sunday nights. Sarah's face went bright red. Brad, we're in the middle of a family meeting. Brad looked around the room as if noticing the rest of us for the first time. Oh, sorry, I'm Brad, Sarah's boyfriend. He flopped down on the couch next to Sarah with casual familiarity. Is this about the money thing? Because I've got some business ventures that could really benefit from some investment capital if Mason's interested in helping out the family. The silence in the room was deafening. My parents looked mortified, Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear, and I felt a cold clarity settling over me. What kind of business ventures? I asked Brad, genuinely curious about how deep this was going to go. I'm building my social media presence, Brad said enthusiastically. Influencer marketing, affiliate partnerships, that sort of thing. I just need some startup capital for equipment and marketing campaigns, maybe 10 or 15,000 to really get things rolling. I looked at Sarah, who was staring at the floor. Is this something you've discussed with Sarah? Oh yeah, Brad said. She told me her brother was going to help her out financially, so I figured the family might be interested in investing in some real opportunities instead of just giving handouts. I closed my notebook and looked around the room at my family. In the span of 10 minutes, the request had gone from $800 for rent to over $2,000 a month for Sarah, plus a $15,000 investment in her boyfriend's social media dreams. This is very enlightening, I said, reaching into my pocket for my phone. I hope you don't mind, but I've been recording this conversation. The reaction was immediate and telling. Sarah jumped up like she had been stung. My father's face went pale, and my mother started shaking her head frantically. You can't do that, Sarah protested. That's illegal. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation, and that would be me, I said calmly. Don't worry, though. I'm not planning to use this against you. I just want to make sure I understand exactly what my family is asking me to do. I stood up and looked around the room one more time. I need a few days to think about all of this. I'll get back to you with my decision. As Claire and I walked toward the door, I could hear my family erupting into heated whispers behind us. On the way out, Brad called after me. If you want to discuss the business opportunities, I've got a whole presentation ready. We could really be partners in something big. In the car, Claire was quiet for several minutes before speaking. I teach 7-year-olds who lie more convincingly than your family just did. I know, I said, feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. But now I have everything I need to decide what comes next. What came next was going to require careful planning and probably some help from people outside my immediate family. because what I had just witnessed wasn't a temporary financial crisis or a family member asking for help during a difficult time. This was a systematic pattern of manipulation, entitlement, and financial abuse that had been going on for years, and it was about to stop. The next morning, I started making phone calls that I should have made years ago. The first was to my grandmother Betty, my father's mother, who lived in a comfortable, assisted living facility about 30 minutes from town. At 82, she was still sharp as a nail and had always been the unofficial family historian, someone who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, and every significant event in our extended family's life. "Mason, honey," she said when I arrived at her apartment that afternoon. I was wondering when someone was going to come talk to me about what's been going on. Her small apartment was neat and comfortable, filled with decades of family photos and furniture that held memories from the house where my father had grown up. But sitting across from her in her favorite armchair, I could see something in her eyes that I had never noticed before, a deep sadness mixed with what looked like shame. "Grandma, I need to ask you about Sarah," I said gently. "Has she been coming to see you lately?" My grandmother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. "She came by about 3 months ago. Said she was having some financial difficulties and wondered if I could help her out with a small loan." "How much did she ask for?" $5,000, my grandmother said quietly. "She said it was for medical expenses that her insurance wouldn't cover. She promised she'd pay it back within 2 months." I felt my heart sink. Did she pay it back? My grandmother shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. "She stopped answering my calls after about 6 weeks. When I asked your parents about it, they said she was too stressed to talk to family members right now. Grandma, $5,000 is your emergency fund." I said, remembering conversations we'd had about her finances and her careful budgeting on a fixed income. "I know," she whispered. "I've been too ashamed to tell anyone. At my age, I should know better than to be taken advantage of by my own granddaughter." I reached over and took her hand. "This isn't your fault. Sarah is an adult who chose to lie to you. There's more," my grandmother said, her voice getting even smaller. "Margaret next door mentioned that she saw Sarah here again last week when I was at my doctor's appointment. The front desk said a young woman claiming to be my granddaughter had asked about getting access to my apartment to pick up some things for her grandmother. The implications of this were terrifying. Sarah had been attempting to gain unsupervised access to our grandmother's apartment, presumably to look for anything valuable she could take or any financial information she could exploit. From my grandmother's apartment, I drove directly to see my cousin Michael, who lived across town with his wife Jessica. Michael was an electrician who worked steady hours and lived a simple, honest life. He and Jessica had been planning their wedding for over a year, saving every penny to pay for their dream celebration. I was wondering when this conversation would happen, Michael said, when I explained why I had come to see him. His normally cheerful demeanor was subdued, and Jessica looked like she had been crying recently. "She came to us last year," Jessica explained, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "Said she needed $3,000 to help cover rent after losing her job. She promised it was just a loan and that she'd pay us back before our wedding. She knew how hard we've been working to save for this wedding." Michael added, his hands clenched into fists. "We've been putting away every extra dollar for 2 years. Jessica's been working double shifts at the hospital, and I've been taking every overtime job I can get." "Did you get any of it back?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Not a penny," Jessica said. "And when we asked her about it, she said we were being selfish for pressuring her when she was going through such a hard time. She actually accused us of caring more about a party than about family." I learned that Sarah's theft had forced them to downsize their wedding plans significantly. The venue they had dreamed of was no longer affordable. Jessica's dress had come from a discount store instead of the bridal shop where she had originally planned to buy it. They had cut their guest list in half and eliminated most of the special touches they had been planning. "The worst part," Michael said, "is that we kept it secret because we didn't want to cause drama in the family. We thought maybe she really was having a hard time and would pay us back eventually. From Michael and Jessica's house, I drove to see my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister who worked as a nurse at the regional medical center. Patricia had always been the most financially responsible person in the family, someone who paid her bills on time and lived within her means. When I called and asked if I could stop by to talk about family matters, the long pause told me that she too had a story to tell. "I made a mistake," Patricia said simply when we sat down in her kitchen. "A big one." She explained that Sarah had come to her 8 months ago with what seemed like a legitimate request. Sarah claimed that she had been accepted into a certification program that would help her get a better job, but she needed someone to co-sign for a student loan because her credit wasn't good enough on her own. The loan was for $12,000, Patricia said. Sarah promised that the program would lead directly to a job that would pay enough for her to make the payments easily. "Let me guess," I said. "She never enrolled in any program." "She enrolled," Patricia said bitterly. "But she dropped out after 2 weeks and spent the money on something else. Now I'm responsible for the full amount, and Sarah claims she can't make the payments because of her anxiety issues." Patricia showed me the loan documents and the payment schedule. She was facing nearly $400 a month in payments for a loan that had benefited only Sarah's spending habits. As a single woman living on a nurse's salary, this was a significant financial hardship. "I've been working extra shifts just to keep up with the payments," Patricia said. "And I'm terrified that if I can't pay, it's going to destroy my credit rating." "Why haven't you talked to my parents about this?" I asked. "I did," Patricia said. "Your mother told me that Sarah was going through a difficult time and that I should be more understanding. Your father said that family problems should be handled privately and that involving lawyers or debt collectors would just make everything worse." The pattern was becoming clear. Sarah wasn't just manipulating my parents and stealing from family members. She was systematically exploiting everyone in our extended family, while my parents provided cover for her actions by discouraging family members from discussing their problems with each other. That evening, I sat down with all the information I had gathered and tried to calculate the full scope of Sarah's financial abuse. $5,000 from our grandmother, $3,000 from Michael and Jessica, $12,000 in loans that Aunt Patricia was now responsible for, over $30,000 from my parents over the past 2 years. And who knew how much in credit card debt and other obligations? We were looking at more than $50,000 in financial damage that Sarah had inflicted on our family in just the past 2 years. And that was only what I had discovered so far. The next day, I called a private investigator that a friend had recommended. Nancy Rodriguez specialized in financial investigations and had experience with family fraud cases. When I explained the situation, she was immediately interested. "This kind of systematic family financial abuse is more common than people realize," Nancy told me during our initial meeting. "The challenge is that family members often don't want to pursue legal remedies because they hope the situation will improve on its own." "What can you find out that I haven't already discovered?" I asked. "Bank records, credit reports, employment history, spending patterns," Nancy replied. "If she's been doing this to your family, there's a good chance she's been doing it to other people too. I can also help you document everything in a way that would be useful if you decide to pursue legal action." Within a week, Nancy had uncovered information that was both shocking and completely predictable. Sarah had been working intermittent cash jobs while collecting unemployment benefits, which was fraud. She had opened credit cards using my parents' address and financial information, which was identity theft. She had been selling items online that she claimed were her own, but had actually borrowed from family members. The total financial damage is probably closer to $70,000, Nancy told me when she presented her findings. And she's been systematically lying to government agencies, creditors, and family members for at least 3 years. "Is any of this criminal?" I asked. "Elder abuse, definitely," Nancy said. "Financial fraud, identity theft, unemployment fraud. If your family wanted to press charges, there's enough evidence to support multiple felony convictions. But Nancy also explained something else that I hadn't considered. The reason this has been allowed to continue for so long is that your parents have been enabling it every step of the way. They've been covering for her, making excuses, and preventing family members from taking action that might have stopped this years ago. That night, I called a meeting with my grandmother, my Uncle Thomas, my cousin Michael and Jessica, and my Aunt Patricia. We met at Thomas's office neutral ground, where we could speak freely without worrying about my parents overhearing anything. I think it's time we all stopped handling this privately, I told the group. Sarah isn't going to stop on her own, and my parents aren't going to stop enabling her. The question is, what are we willing to do about it? The conversation that followed was difficult and emotional, but it was also the first time in years that our family members had been completely honest with each other about what was happening. Everyone agreed that the situation had gone beyond the point where quiet family discussions could solve anything. "What do you think we should do?" my grandmother asked. "I think we should give my parents one last chance to do the right thing," I said. "Complete honesty, no more lies, no more manipulation. And if they choose to continue protecting Sarah instead of protecting the rest of the family, then we take steps to protect ourselves." Uncle Thomas nodded slowly. "You're talking about legal action." "I'm talking about truth," I replied, "and consequences. Sarah is an adult who's been making choices for years. It's time for her to face the results of those choices instead of passing the costs on to everyone else." As we left the meeting, I realized that what was coming next would probably tear my immediate family apart. But what Sarah and my parents had already done had been tearing our extended family apart for years. The only difference was that now, instead of suffering in isolation, we were going to stand together and demand accountability. The time for family meetings and gentle conversations was over. What came next would determine whether my family learned to function honestly or fell apart completely under the weight of years of deception and financial abuse. I spent 3 days preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I consulted with a legal advocate who specialized in elder abuse cases, organized all the documentation Nancy had gathered, and arranged for several family members to be present as witnesses and support. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at my parents' house. I told them I'd made a decision about Sarah's situation and wanted to discuss it with the whole family present. What they didn't know was that I had also invited Uncle Thomas, Aunt Patricia, and my grandmother to join us. When my parents opened the door to find not just me and Claire, but half of the extended family standing on their front porch, the confusion on their faces was almost comical. "What's going on?" my mother asked, looking back and forth between all of us. "Family meeting," I said simply. "We need to discuss Sarah's situation, and everyone here has been affected by it." My parents reluctantly let us all into the house. Sarah was there lounging in the living room with Brad, both of them looking annoyed at having their afternoon interrupted by what they clearly expected to be another boring family discussion about money. "Before we start," I said, taking a position where I could address the entire room, "I want everyone to understand that this conversation is being recorded and that everything said here today has legal implications." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Sarah sat up straight. Brad looked confused, and my parents exchanged worried glances. "Mason," my father started, "I don't think recording is necessary for a family conversation." "Actually," said Helen Kumar, the legal advocate, as she entered the room behind us, "recording is essential when we're discussing potential criminal activity." Sarah's face went white. "Criminal activity? What are you talking about?" I pulled out a folder filled with the documentation Nancy had assembled over the past 2 weeks. Bank statements, credit reports, employment records, social media screenshots, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of financial transactions. "Let's start with the $5,000 you stole from Grandma Betty," I said, placing the first set of documents on the coffee table. "I didn't steal anything," Sarah protested, but her voice was shaky. "That was a loan." A loan that you never intended to repay, my grandmother said firmly, her voice stronger than I had heard it in years. A loan you obtained by lying about medical expenses. I placed the next set of documents on the table. $3,000 from Michael and Jessica's wedding fund, also obtained through false pretenses. Jessica spoke up from her position near the window. You knew exactly how hard we had worked to save that money, and you took it anyway. And $12,000 in student loans that Aunt Patricia is now responsible for, I continued adding more papers to the growing pile. For education programs you never intended to complete. Patricia stepped forward. I've been working 60-hour weeks to make payments on loans that benefited nobody but you. My parents were looking back and forth between the documents and the family members as if they were trying to process information that didn't fit with their understanding of reality. This is ridiculous, Ma, my mother said weakly. Sarah made some mistakes, but calling them criminal is going too far. Let's talk about the mistakes, I said, pulling out Nancy's investigative report. Working for cash while collecting unemployment benefits. Identity theft using Dad's financial information to open credit cards. Attempting to gain unauthorized access to Grandma's apartment when she wasn't home. Each revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah's face cycled through expressions of shock, anger, and growing panic. Brad was slowly edging toward the door as if he was considering making a run for it. Sarah, my father said, his voice barely above a whisper, tell me this isn't true. For a moment, I thought she might actually confess and try to make amends. Instead, she chose the path that was most familiar to her. Everyone is ganging up on me, she said, tears starting to flow. I've been going through a really hard time, and instead of supporting me, my own family is treating me like a criminal. You are a criminal, Thomas said bluntly, speaking up for the first time. Elder abuse is a felony. Identity theft is a felony. Fraud is a felony. I never abused anyone, Sarah protested. You stole money from an 82-year-old woman who lives on a fixed income, Helen Kumar interjected. In the state of Ohio, that's the definition of financial elder abuse. The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's crying, but even her tears seemed calculated, designed to evoke sympathy rather than express genuine remorse. There's more, I said, because I knew that half-truths would only lead to more manipulation later. Nancy's investigation uncovered credit card accounts, online sales of borrowed items, and financial transactions that paint a picture of systematic fraud going back at least 3 years. I placed the final stack of documents on the table. The total financial damage to this family is approximately $70,000. And that's just what we've been able to document so far. My mother sank into her chair as if all the strength had left her body. My father stared at the documents as if he could make them disappear through sheer force of will. $70,000, he repeated numbly. And that doesn't include the emotional damage, Jessica said, her voice shaking with anger. The stress, the broken trust, the family relationships that have been destroyed by years of lies. Sarah suddenly stood up, her tears stopping as abruptly as they had started. Fine, she said, her voice hard with anger. You want to treat me like the enemy, then I'll be your enemy. I'll tell everyone what a horrible family you are. I'll ruin all of your reputations. With what? I asked calmly. More lies. I'll say you forced me into debt. I'll say you abused me. I'll say whatever I need to say to make sure you all pay for this. The mask had finally slipped completely. No more tears, no more claims of being overwhelmed or anxious, just cold, calculating anger at being caught and held accountable. Brad, who had been silent through most of this, finally spoke up. Look, I don't know anything about any of this family drama. Sarah and I just started dating a few months ago. According to these bank records, I said, consulting Nancy's report, you've been receiving money transfers from Sarah for 6 months. Money that came from her theft from family members. Brad's confident demeanor evaporated instantly. I didn't know where the money came from. She said her family was helping her out. Congratulations, Helen Kumar said to Brad. You're potentially an accessory to financial fraud. At that point, Sarah completely lost control. She started screaming at everyone in the room, accusing us of jealousy, of ruining her life, of being vindictive and cruel. The 15-minute tantrum she threw was like watching a small child's meltdown, except the child was a 29-year-old woman who had systematically stolen from elderly family members. When she finally stopped screaming, the silence in the room was profound. Sarah, my father said quietly, what have you done to our family? But Sarah had one more card to play. I'm not the only one with secrets, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Want to tell Mason about the second mortgage? Want to explain why you really need him to pay my rent? My parents' faces went ashen. Even in her rage, Sarah had enough cunning left to try to shift blame and create chaos. We already know about your financial situation, I told my parents gently. Uncle Thomas told us about the foreclosure proceedings. The look of betrayal that crossed my father's face as he turned toward Thomas was painful to see. But Thomas stood his ground. You asked me for advice about bankruptcy, Thomas said. I gave it to you. Stop enabling Sarah and start dealing with reality. The difference, I continued, is that if you had come to me honestly about your financial problems, I would have helped you figure out a solution. Instead, you tried to manipulate me into subsidizing the person who caused your financial problems in the first place. My mother started crying, then not the calculated tears that Sarah had used, but the broken sobs of someone whose world was collapsing around her. We just wanted to help her, she whispered. She's our daughter. And they're your family too, my grandmother said firmly, gesturing around the room at all the people Sarah had stolen from. Did we not matter? The meeting ended with Sarah storming out of the house, threatening to destroy everyone who had betrayed her. Brad followed her, but not before promising that this wasn't over and that we would regret making him part of this situation. My parents sat in their living room surrounded by family members and evidence of their daughter's crimes, finally forced to confront the reality they had been avoiding for years. What happens now? My father asked. Helen Kumar answered before I could. Now your family has decisions to make. You can continue enabling criminal behavior, or you can start protecting yourselves and seeking justice for the people who have been harmed. As we all prepared to leave, I turned back to my parents one more time. I meant what I said about helping you with your financial situation, I told them. But only if you're done protecting Sarah from the consequences of her choices. Outside, as our extended family stood on the front lawn, my grandmother took my arm. Thank you, she said simply. I've been carrying this shame for months, thinking it was my fault for being too trusting. It was never your fault, Grandma, I told her, and it's never too late to demand justice. But even as I said those words, I knew that the hardest part was still ahead of us. Sarah had made it clear that she had no intention of accepting responsibility or making amends, and my parents were going to have to choose between their daughter and the rest of their family. The battle for accountability was just beginning. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the most intense period of my life. Sarah's threats to destroy everyone who had exposed her weren't just empty words. She launched a coordinated attack designed to discredit me professionally and personally, while simultaneously trying to manipulate law enforcement and government agencies into viewing her as a victim rather than a perpetrator. It started on Monday morning when I arrived at work to find my boss, Eric Miller, waiting for me with a serious expression. Eric was a fair man who had always supported my career development, but the look on his face suggested that something significant had happened over the weekend. Mason, we need to talk, he said, gesturing toward his office. I received some disturbing phone calls this morning about your character and your treatment of family members. My stomach dropped as I realized that Sarah had moved faster than I had anticipated. What kind of phone calls? Someone claiming to be your sister called both our main number and our HR department. She alleged that you've been financially abusing her, threatening her, and using your position here to intimidate family members into making false accusations against her. Eric handed me a printed email that had been sent to multiple people at our company, including several clients. The email, sent from an account using a variation of my name, contained detailed accusations of financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and professional misconduct. It was written in a way that sounded plausible to anyone who didn't know the full story. She also filed a police report, Eric continued, claiming that you've been harassing her and threatening her financial security. The police called here this morning asking about your character and whether we've observed any concerning behavior. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the sophistication of Sarah's attack. She had correctly identified that my career and reputation were the things I valued most, and she was systematically trying to destroy both. Eric, I need to tell you exactly what's been happening with my family, I said. And over the next hour, I walked him through everything we had discovered about Sarah's financial crimes, the family meeting, and her threats afterward. To his credit, Eric listened without interrupting and asked thoughtful questions about the documentation we had gathered. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "This is a serious situation," he said finally. "I believe you, but we need to handle this carefully to protect both you and the company." Eric recommended that I contact Marcus Thompson, an employment attorney who specialized in defending professionals against false accusations. He also suggested that I take a few days off while we sorted out the immediate crisis. That afternoon, I met with Marcus, who listened to my story with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen similar situations before. "The good news," Marcus said, "is that her accusations are so extreme and so detailed that they'll be easy to disprove with proper documentation. The bad news is that false accusations can still damage your reputation even after they're proven false." Marcus immediately began working to counter Sarah's allegations. He contacted the police detective handling her complaint, provided documentation of her actual financial crimes, and submitted a formal complaint about her filing of false police reports. But the legal system moved slowly and Sarah wasn't finished. On Wednesday, I received a call from my bank informing me that someone had attempted to open credit accounts using my personal information. The applications had been flagged because they contained inconsistencies, but it was clear that Sarah had attempted identity theft as part of her revenge campaign. That same day, Claire received harassment at her school when someone called the principal claiming that she was dating a man who financially abuses vulnerable family members. The call was obviously from Sarah, but it still required Claire to have an uncomfortable conversation with her supervisor about our personal situation. "She's trying to isolate you," Marcus observed when I updated him on these developments. Classic pattern for people who are facing accountability. Attack your support systems and try to make you feel like fighting back isn't worth the cost. But Sarah had made a critical mistake. Detective Ray Martinez, who was investigating her false police report, was experienced in financial crimes and family fraud cases. When Marcus provided him with Nancy's investigative report and the documentation from our family meeting, Detective Martinez immediately recognized the pattern. "Your sister is facing some serious charges," Detective Martinez told me during a meeting at the police station. "Elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and now filing false police reports. The evidence is overwhelming." "What happens now?" I asked. "We're going to arrest her," Detective Martinez said simply, "and we're going to recommend that the prosecutor pursue felony charges." The arrest happened on Friday morning. Sarah was taken into custody at the apartment she shared with her roommate Amanda, who later told me that Sarah had been in a state of escalating panic all week, making frantic phone calls and attempting to delete social media accounts and other digital evidence. The irony was that her attempt to destroy me had actually accelerated the criminal case against her. By filing false police reports and attempting identity theft, she had given law enforcement additional crimes to charge her with, and her lies to the police had been so extreme that they actually strengthened the case for prosecuting her original financial crimes. But the legal victory felt hollow when I thought about what it meant for my parents. I went to see them that evening after Sarah's arrest made the local news. I found them sitting in their living room looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen them. "We saw the news," my father said quietly. "Our daughter is in jail." "Your daughter is in jail because she committed crimes," I replied, trying to keep my voice gentle despite my frustration. "This isn't something that happened to her. This is something she chose." My mother had been crying and her face was puffy and red. "How did we get here?" she asked. "How did our family fall apart like this?" For the first time since this whole crisis began, I sat down with my parents and had an honest conversation about the years of enabling that had led to this moment. "You taught her that actions don't have consequences," I explained. "Every time she made a bad choice, you fixed it for her. Every time someone else was hurt by her behavior, you made excuses for her. You trained her to believe that she could do anything she wanted and someone else would handle the problems." "We were trying to help our child," my father protested. "You were helping her become a criminal," I said bluntly. "And in the process, you taught her that stealing from elderly family members was acceptable as long as she had a good excuse." The conversation was painful, but it was also necessary. My parents were finally beginning to understand that their attempts to protect Sarah had actually hurt her and everyone else in the family. "What do we do now?" my mother asked. "Now you start telling the truth," I said. "To yourselves, to the legal system, and to the family members Sarah hurt. You stop making excuses and start supporting justice." Over the weekend, my parents consulted with their own attorney and made the difficult decision to cooperate with the criminal prosecution rather than trying to protect Sarah from the consequences of her actions. On Monday morning, I returned to work to find that the cloud of suspicion that had been hanging over me was completely gone. Eric had received calls from Detective Martinez and from Marcus confirming that the allegations against me were false and that I was actually the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Eric said, "but I'm also impressed with how you handled it. A lot of people would have tried to handle this privately and let the accusations stand unchallenged." The following week brought news that Sarah had been indicted on multiple felony charges. The prosecutor's office was taking the case seriously because elder abuse was a priority in their jurisdiction, and because Sarah's pattern of behavior suggested that she was likely to continue victimizing people if not held accountable. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from my grandmother. I testified to the grand jury yesterday. She told me, her voice stronger and more confident than I had heard in months. I told them exactly what Sarah did and how it affected me. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Proud," she said without hesitation. "For the first time in months, I feel proud instead of ashamed. I'm not the one who should have been ashamed of anything." As the legal process moved forward, my extended family began the slow process of healing and rebuilding trust. Michael and Jessica were able to recover their stolen wedding money through restitution orders. Aunt Patricia was relieved of responsibility for the student loans through legal action against Sarah. But the real healing happened in family gatherings, where we could finally be honest with each other about what we had experienced and what we had learned. "I should have talked to all of you years ago," Michael said during a dinner at Uncle Thomas's house. "I let Sarah convince me that keeping her secrets was protecting the family, when really it was just enabling her to hurt more people." "We all made that mistake," Patricia added. "We thought we were being kind by handling things privately, but we were actually being cruel to each other by not warning each other about what she was doing." As we prepared for Sarah's trial, I realized that the battle for accountability had been won, but the work of rebuilding trust and healthy relationships was just beginning. The most important lesson I had learned was that protecting someone from consequences isn't love, it's enabling. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full weight of their choices, even when those choices lead to criminal prosecution. Sarah was going to face justice for her crimes. My family was going to learn to function honestly. and I was going to continue building a life based on integrity rather than manipulation. The battle was ending, but the real victory was just beginning. 6 months after Sarah's arrest, I stood in a courtroom, watching my sister receive her sentence 18 months in prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft, followed by 3 years of probation. The judge also ordered full restitution to all of her victims, including payment plans that would extend well beyond her release date. As I listened to the judge explain the reasoning behind the sentence, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, sadness about what our family had lost, and hope for what we might be able to rebuild. The defendant has shown a pattern of targeting vulnerable family members for financial exploitation, the judge said, looking directly at Sarah. This behavior represents a fundamental breach of trust that strikes at the heart of family bonds and community safety. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, with her court-appointed attorney, still maintaining the defiant posture she had adopted throughout the legal process. Even facing prison time, she had refused to accept responsibility or express genuine remorse for her actions. But the most powerful moment came when my grandmother was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. "I want to say something to my granddaughter," my grandmother said, her voice clear and strong as she stood at the podium. "Sarah, I loved you enough to trust you with my life savings. I hope that someday you'll learn to love yourself enough to take responsibility for your choices." The impact of those words was visible on Sarah's face. For just a moment, the defiance cracked, and I could see something that might have been shame or regret. After the sentencing, our family gathered at a restaurant to process what we had just experienced. My parents, who had been attending counseling sessions with Dr. Caroline Foster for months, looked exhausted but somehow cleaner, as if a burden they had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. "I never imagined it would come to this," my mother said quietly, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. "None of us did," I replied, "but sometimes this is what healing looks like." My father, who had been mostly silent throughout the meal, finally spoke up. "I keep thinking about all the times we could have stopped this if we had just been honest about what was happening." Dr. Foster, who had joined us for this difficult day, nodded thoughtfully. "Recovery from family dysfunction is a process," she said. "What matters now is what you do with the understanding you've gained." Over the past 6 months, my parents had made remarkable progress in therapy. They had learned to recognize the difference between helping and enabling, between love and manipulation. They had also taken concrete steps to address their own financial crisis with honesty instead of attempting to manipulate other family members into solving their problems. Uncle Thomas had helped them restructure their debts and create a realistic budget that would allow them to keep their house while paying back the money they owed. It would be several years of tight living, but it was manageable with proper planning and no additional financial drain from supporting Sarah's lifestyle. "The hardest part," my mother admitted, "has been accepting that trying to fix Sarah's problems actually made them worse, and learning that we hurt other family members by protecting her from consequences," my father added. The restitution payments Sarah owed to family members were being handled through the court system, which meant that my grandmother Michael and Jessica and Aunt Patricia would actually recover the money that had been stolen from them. It would take years, but the legal system had mechanisms in place to ensure that victims of financial crimes received compensation. More importantly, our extended family had learned to communicate honestly with each other. We had regular family dinners where people felt safe to discuss problems without fear of judgment or manipulation. We had established boundaries about financial assistance that protected everyone involved. "I think the biggest change," Aunt Patricia said, "is that we're not afraid to ask for help anymore, and we're not afraid to say no when helping would actually hurt someone." A few weeks after the sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call from someone at the prison where Sarah was serving her time. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Warren, and I'm calling about your sister Sarah," the voice said. "She's requested to speak with you as part of the Victim Impact Program we offer here." "What kind of program?" I asked, immediately suspicious of anything that might be another manipulation attempt. It's designed to help offenders understand the real impact of their crimes on the people they hurt, Dr. Warren explained. Participation is voluntary for both the offender and the victims, and it's supervised by professional counselors. After discussing it with Claire and my family, I decided to participate. I was curious whether Sarah had experienced any genuine change, and I thought it might provide closure for both of us. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the prison, with Dr. Warren facilitating the conversation. Sarah looked different than I remembered, thinner, with shorter hair and no makeup. But more significantly, she carried herself differently. The entitled confidence was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine uncertainty. "I wanted to apologize," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Not because the counselors told me to, but because I've had time to think about what I actually did to our family." "What have you learned?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "That I never learned how to take care of myself," she said slowly. "I learned how to manipulate people into taking care of me, but I never learned how to be responsible for my own life." Over the course of our hour-long conversation, Sarah demonstrated a level of self-awareness that I had never seen from her before. She talked about the progression from small lies to major financial crimes and how each successful manipulation had made the next one seem easier and more justified. "I convinced myself that family members should help each other," she said. "But I was really just taking from people who couldn't afford to give, and I was too selfish to care about the damage I was causing." "What are you planning to do when you get out?" I asked. "I'm enrolled in a financial literacy program here," she said, "and I'm working on my GED. But mostly I'm trying to figure out how to live without depending on other people to fix my mistakes." I left the prison feeling cautiously hopeful. Sarah still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, she seemed to be taking responsibility for her own life instead of expecting other people to solve her problems. 6 months later, Claire and I were married in a small ceremony that included all the family members who had supported us through the crisis. My parents walked me down the aisle together, symbolizing their commitment to being honest and supportive rather than manipulative. My grandmother, now 83 and more vibrant than she had been in years, gave a toast at our reception. "I've learned that family isn't about protecting each other from consequences," she said, raising her glass. "It's about supporting each other through consequences and helping each other grow stronger." Michael and Jessica, who had been able to have their dream wedding after receiving restitution payments, hosted our reception at their home. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful in a way that our family gatherings hadn't been for years. "Thank you," Michael said to me during a quiet moment, "for having the courage to tell the truth when the rest of us were too scared." "We all told the truth eventually," I replied. "That's what matters." A year after Sarah's sentencing, she was released from prison and entered a structured rehabilitation program that included job training and supervised independent living. Our contact was limited to occasional letters where she updated the family on her progress and continued to make amends for her past actions. In one letter, she wrote, "I'm learning that earning people's trust back is harder than losing it, but it's also more satisfying than any of the shortcuts I used to take." My parents continued their counseling and gradually rebuilt relationships with extended family members who had been hurt by their enabling behavior. They learned to offer support in healthy ways and to maintain boundaries that protected everyone involved. The hardest lesson, my father told me during one of our monthly dinners, was learning that saying no to someone you love is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. 2 years after the crisis began, our family had transformed from a dysfunctional system based on manipulation and enabling into a network of people who supported each other's growth and held each other accountable for responsible behavior. I learned that protecting yourself from manipulation isn't selfishness. It's the first step toward helping your family heal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior even when it hurts. Real family supports each other's growth, not each other's dysfunction. The experience taught me that justice isn't about punishment. It's about creating consequences that encourage growth and prevent further harm. Sarah's time in prison gave her the structure and support she needed to learn skills she had never developed. My parents' financial struggles taught them to live within their means and ask for help honestly when they needed it. Most importantly, I learned that healing from family dysfunction is possible, but it requires courage to tell the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. It requires setting boundaries even when setting boundaries feels cruel. And it requires supporting each other through the difficult process of change instead of protecting each other from the need to change. Today, my marriage with Claire is built on the foundation of honesty and mutual respect that I learned to value through this crisis. My relationship with my parents is stronger because it's based on truth instead of manipulation. My extended family is closer because we've learned to communicate openly about problems instead of hiding them out of misplaced loyalty. And Sarah is building a life based on her own efforts instead of other people's sacrifices, which is ultimately the greatest gift we could have given her. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that real love sometimes requires saying no. It requires letting people face consequences. It requires choosing difficult truths over comfortable lies. But when families learn to function this way, they become stronger than they ever imagined possible. As I think about this journey, I'm curious about your own experiences with family boundaries and accountability. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between keeping peace and demanding honesty in your relationships? How do you balance supporting the people you love with protecting yourself from manipulation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think differently about family dynamics, please like this video to help others find it. And if you're interested in more stories about overcoming family challenges and building healthier relationships, subscribe to our channel for new content every week. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but ultimately hopeful journey. Remember that choosing truth over comfort isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Here's to building families based on love, honesty, and mutual respect.